Ladies and gentlemen, I am Yusril. It is the 28th of December 2016 and the game is World of Warships, where the shit has not only hit the fan, it is flying off it and spattering the entire room with little gobbets of liquidized excrement that are going to take ages to get out of the decor. Yes folks, Wargaming EU's self-inflicted PR disaster over the Christmas convoys is still rolling on. This isn't really a surprise, it's the week between Christmas and the New Year. In Britain we often call this the dead week, because a lot of people are on holiday and there's little point trying to get anything major done, so everyone else just sits on their hands, plans the New Year booze up, and declares that they are never having the in-laws over for Christmas ever again after they refused to sell Regent Street. Which makes it pretty much the worst week of the year to have a problem of any kind at work, because half your key people are out of the office. All of which goes some way to explaining why Wargaming have gone relatively quiet on us so far. I did my initial video on the whole Christmas convoy flare-up in the small hours of the 22nd of December. It's now the 28th. What's happened in the interim? Well, the 22nd saw Wargaming EU reload, take careful aim, and empty both barrels into their feet again, with the news post announcing Graf, the Santa boxes, and the special achievements. Mostly it was pretty uncontroversial stuff, but someone must have been huffing the primo American destroyer smoke when they decided to include the line, "We really are spoiling you, aren't we?" That would have come across as cocky at the best of times, but 24 hours after the European community discovered that they weren't getting the second campaign that everyone else was, ooh, yeah, nasty. Suffice to say that the general opinion seems to have been not compared to the other servers, you aren't, and that opinion was then salted with various expletives, obscenities, and instructions to go forth and multiply, depending on the person's taste. With the flames rising to levels not seen since some idiot in Pudding Lane left the oven on, Tucky broke cover on the 23rd, and, well, at least he recognised that there was a, quote, mess, unquote. I can kinda understand him on this one. As well as the campaign problem, the community contributors had been made to look like fools when the devs made a major nerf to the German destroyers immediately after their launch, and thus rendered the community work inaccurate as a result. On top of the apparently absurdly short notice, allegedly it was a matter of hours, that they were given to prep their videos before the embargo lifted. Tucky had a solid chunk on his plate at the time, and either the damage was done with regard to the contributors and the German destroyers, or there wasn't anything he could actually do bar basic damage control. I've been in a similar position myself, and yeah, it's not fun when you can't do jack except take the shit. On the 26th, Felon, who I think is Tucky's senior, I'm not 100% sure, got back into the office and put out an update, which basically boiled down to community team can't actually do anything except report up to the people responsible, which we've done. Plus no flame? Which is fair enough. Although it's possibly not a good thing for the decision makers to be so completely isolated from the client base that a major backlash can burn from 4 days and has to be précéded by the community team before they will take any notice. A day later, the 27th, Felon came back to us, and this statement is where we currently stand. I find it interesting that he has tabbed, italicised and quote-marked this statement. It's not his usual typesetting, and it strongly suggests that the statement isn't from him as such, it's from the shadowy cabal of decision-making people, whoever they are. So, what do I make of this statement? Okay, let's break this down. Looking at the first paragraph, quote, "We considered this experimental double campaign approach used in other regions and saw flaws in it. The double campaign system does not cater to our audience in the usual manner we prepare offers. It was experimental, and as we were not convinced it would work with benefit for the general audience, we decided to opt out of this part of the end-of-year activities." Unquote. So if the cabal weren't convinced that the double campaign approach would work in the EU, wouldn't it have been a better idea to run the experiment along with the other servers and see what happened? If the cabal's right, great. Then get to say, "We told you so" at the next shadowy get-together and the whole experiment gets written off as a failure. Lesson learned. If they've called it wrong, then the Cabal ends up making more money over the festive season because people buy Graf, or even the bundles to get ahead, and woohoo! Money, money, money! Seriously, how could they lose? All they had to do was mimic the other servers, test the new approach, and see what happened. The second paragraph is, frankly, equally mind-bending. Quote, "We knew that the Graf-ic itself would be a really important element to our players. That is why keeping this part of the event was an obvious choice. We also knew that many players would want to get their hands on special vanity items. Problems started here. The structure of the campaign, combined with its time limitation, did not, in our opinion, provided anybody except top payers the option to get the items without major time commitment. This is not something we wanted, nor felt right to ask of our players in the holiday period, when a big part of our loyal player base does not want to struggle between the game and family needs." Unquote. Well, the first few sentences state the obvious. The main attraction was the Graf-ic, and premium camo isn't exactly a vanity item, given its benefits for grinding. Then the logic either heads off into realms of genius that I am too stupid to comprehend, or else degenerates into blithering idiocy that, frankly, I don't want to. The first point that has to be observed is that the time commitment, assuming a player of given skills pulls in a relatively constant amount of XP per hour, stays much the same. The advantage that the, quote, top payers, as opposed to top players, get is that they can start earlier than we cheapskates getting Graf through the campaign and spread the time investment for the convoys over several weeks rather than having to pack it into the period between the 9th and 18th of January, which, by the way, is not normally part of the holiday season as far as I'm aware. Hell, the traditional British Christmas has usually descended into domestic acrimony by around about 4 p.m. on the 26th of December, possibly earlier if anyone utters the dreaded word monopoly. I suspect that a lot of the player base would not in fact particularly struggle balancing family and game, at least not more so than usual, at that point in the middle of January. It should also be noted that by EU standards the campaigns are not particularly demanding, not compared to the challenges we got for the Arpeggio missions. As I understand it, some people are still chasing Nachi with 3 days to go. The third paragraph, they're actually being kind of reasonable here. No doubt some, maybe even most, people aren't that interested in Graf-ic and are sufficiently cash-rich and time-poor that they'd rather just cherry-pick one or two of the camos for ships that they regard as keepers. Of course, that does run counter to the statement in the second paragraph that Graf-ic would be a really important element to our players. And again, I'd note that the free run at the campaign from the 9th to the 18th of January doesn't really constitute part of the holiday season in Europe, the bits of it that I'm familiar with at least. It also, of course, forces those of us who were relishing a bit of a challenge from the campaigns to cough up for the camos we want, thereby removing what inducement we had to buy Graf. And, 1,000 doubloons per player, maybe 3,000 if you're snagging the Tirpitz camo versus twice that? More? Much more? For buying Graf? Not sure I'm following the logic here. And so we come to the final paragraph, what they're going to do about the situation, and it's pretty heavily implied in the first sentence, where they say, quote, "even if we decide to take action," unquote, that doing nothing is firmly on the cards. I must note here that I suspect whoever wrote this didn't have English as their first language, or that it's been translated possibly imprecisely from another language. There are a couple of phrases and some grammar that are slightly off. A good example is in the first sentence of the third paragraph. Even if we decide to take action in the following days, neither of them will have an immediate effect. My phrasing for that would have been, there will not be an immediate effect. Neither of suggests that there are two options on the table besides doing nothing. The other point in that third paragraph, where the English reads a little bit oddly, is, quote, "we'll manage to make you enjoy the end-of-year activities," unquote. Does make carry the sense of compulsion, as opposed to construction in this context in, say, Russian, that it does in English? What would I do in Wargaming's position? Well, first and foremost, restore as much parity between the European Union and the other servers as possible by bringing in the convoy campaign. The head start offered by the bundles is probably irretrievably shot. By the time the campaign has been tweaked, localised, tested and implemented, I suspect it will be the 9th of January, and the free players will have started their convoy raids on the other servers. But the European players who bought the bundles did so under the impression that they weren't going to get the campaign at all, so you could argue that putting it in even at a late stage is actually a bonus. However, if the patch cycle to restore the campaigns is going to overshoot the 9th, then the convoy raid does need to be extended to compensate, so that anyone who's willing to try the grind gets the same conditions and the same time limit as the free Graf players on the other servers. Simultaneously, it's probably a good idea to put the camouflages into the American, Russian and Southeast Asian clients for purchase, and amend the campaign reward so that anyone who has a camo and then earns it through the campaign gets the doubloons back instead. The point the Cabal made in their third paragraph was completely valid. There will be people who would rather cough up a little bit for the paint job, but don't have the time or the inclination to grind it out. And that's true of the entire player base worldwide, not just the EU. Putting the camos into the client for purchase across the globe allows wargaming as a whole to make a bit more cash, and all the players can get what they want. Finally, wargaming need to actually learn from this mess, rather than just making noises about learning. Major events like this need to be the same across every server, or complaints about unfairness will follow. Wargaming have had this kind of feedback over the last year from the Arpeggio missions, especially the final rounds in the European Union and the United States, where the Europeans felt they were being handed much harder missions than everyone else. While I'm on the topic of Arpeggio, last blow missions, especially when as specific as they were for the European mission for Nachi, are a bad thing. Again, not the first time this has been brought up. Does anyone else remember Myoko's 30 destroyer fiasco back in January? But wargaming didn't learn, and the mistake was repeated in December and November. There were some advantages to Europe's approach to the missions. It made people get out of ruts, stretch themselves and mix their gameplay up to meet the varied objectives, rather than just the generic earn XP that was on the other servers, and this seems to have followed through into the campaigns, which is no bad thing. But the decision-making rests with the Cabal. All we can do is wait, keep making the points as politely as possible. Seriously guys, there's no point shooting Tucky, Conway and Felon. I've been in their position, it is not fun being between a rock and a hard place like this, and from a purely selfish point of view, there's no guarantee the replacements would be any better. Hell, they'd probably be a great deal worse. The Darth Vader school of motivation does not in fact work. And if all else fails, take out the V25 for some stress relief. That girl is way too much fun right now. I have been Yusril, that has been my updated thoughts on the convoy fiasco, and until next time, or at least until there is something worth recording about, I'll see you on the battlefield. Farewell.